The crimson sun dipped below the Pacific horizon on June 3, 1942, casting long shadows across the flight deck of the USS Enterprise. Commander Wade McCluskey stood at the ship's rail, his weathered hands gripping the metal as he watched the last Dauntless dive bomber touch down. With mechanical precision, 6 months had passed since Pearl Harbor's infamy, and the taste of revenge still burned bitter in every American sailor's mouth. Admiral Chester Nimitz had received intelligence that would change everything. Hidden within the labyrinth of Japanese naval communications, American codebreakers at Station HYPO in Pearl Harbor had cracked the enemy's JN-25 cipher. The intercepted messages revealed Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's audacious plan, a massive assault on Midway Atoll, the strategic stepping stone that guarded the approaches to Hawaii and the American West Coast. Yamamoto, architect of Pearl Harbor and Japan's most brilliant naval strategist, commanded a fleet that dwarfed anything America could muster. His combined fleet included 4 aircraft carriers Akagi, Kaga, Hiryu, and Soryu, escorted by battleships, cruisers, and destroyers that stretched across miles of ocean. The Japanese admiral believed this decisive blow would force the Americans into a negotiated peace, securing Japan's empire in the Pacific forever. But Yamamoto had underestimated both American resolve and intelligence capabilities. As referenced in Samuel Eliot Morrison's comprehensive history of United States naval operations. In World War II, the code-breaking efforts proved crucial to American preparation and ultimate victory at Midway. Captain Joseph Rockford, the brilliant cryptanalyst leading Station HYPO, had worked tirelessly with his team to decode Japanese intentions. When intercepted messages referenced Target AF, Rockford suspected it meant Midway. To confirm this theory, he ordered Midway's garrison to transmit an uncoded message reporting problems with their water distillation plant. Within days, Japanese communications intercepted by American listening posts mentioned that AF was having water supply issues. The trap was set, and Yamamoto's hand was revealed. Admiral Nimitz faced a seemingly impossible task. His Pacific Fleet, still recovering from Pearl Harbor's devastation, possessed only 3 operational aircraft carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown. The latter had limped back to Pearl Harbor after the Battle of the Coral Sea in early May, her flight deck scarred by bomb damage and her hull punctured by near misses. Navy Yard workers swarmed over Yorktown like ants, performing what should have been months of repairs in mere days. The odds seemed insurmountable. Yamamoto commanded over 200 vessels, including 11 battleships and 8 aircraft carriers spread across multiple task forces. Against this armada, Nimitz could deploy 27 ships, most of them cruisers and destroyers. Yet the American admiral possessed 2 advantages that would prove decisive: superior intelligence and the element of surprise. On Midway Atoll itself, Marine Colonel Harold Shannon commanded a mixed garrison of 2,200 men. His forces included Marine Fighter Squadron to 121, equipped with outdated Brewster Buffalo fighters that pilots grimly nicknamed Flying Coffins. The Marines also operated ancient Vindicator dive bombers and a handful of B-26 Marauder medium bombers. These obsolete aircraft would face Japan's finest carrier pilots, veterans who had swept across the Pacific with seemingly unstoppable momentum. As June 4th dawned, Admiral Raymond Spruance aboard Enterprise and Admiral Frank Fletcher on Yorktown positioned their task forces northeast of Midway. The Japanese striking force under Admiral Chuichi Nagumo approached from the northwest. Confident in their superior numbers and battle-tested pilots, neither force fully comprehended that they were about to participate in the most decisive naval battle since Trafalgar. The morning air hung heavy with anticipation and the smell of aviation fuel. Mechanics performed final checks on aircraft engines while pilots studied their charts one last time. Radio operators fine-tuned their equipment, knowing that communication would mean the difference between victory and catastrophe. In ready rooms across both fleets, young men barely out of their teens prepared to write history with their courage and sacrifice. The stage was set for a battle that would determine the fate of the Pacific War. At 4:30 on the morning of June 4th, 1942, Admiral Chuichi Nagumo launched his first strike against Midway Atoll. 108 Japanese aircraft, 36 Nakajima K torpedo bombers, 36 Aichi Val dive bombers, and 36 Zero fighters roared off the flight decks of Akagi, Kaga, Hiryu, and Soryu. Leading this aerial armada was Lieutenant Joichi Tominaga, a veteran pilot whose calm demeanor masked the deadly precision of Japan's naval aviation elite. The Japanese formation flew southeast through the pre-dawn darkness, their engines creating a thunderous symphony that echoed across the vast Pacific. These pilots had honed their skills over China's battlefields and perfected their techniques during the lightning campaigns that had conquered Southeast Asia and the Dutch East Indies. They approached Midway with the confidence of warriors who had never known defeat. On Midway, radar operator Private Joseph McDonald detected the incoming formation at 5:34 a.m. when the Japanese strike was still 93 miles away. Air raid sirens wailed across Eastern Island as Marines scrambled to defensive positions. Colonel Shannon's Fighters 26 obsolete Brewster Buffaloes and Grumman Wildcats launched into the morning sky to intercept the attackers. The aerial battle that followed demonstrated the harsh realities of modern warfare. Marine Fighter Squadron 121, led by Major Floyd Parks, climbed desperately to gain altitude advantage over the approaching enemy. Their Buffalo fighters, already obsolete when the war began, struggled against the superior performance of Japanese Zeros. Within minutes of engagement, the sky above Midway became a deadly ballet of twisting aircraft, tracer rounds, and falling debris. Major Parks pressed his attack against overwhelming odds, leading his Marines straight into the heart of the Japanese formation. His radio crackled with desperate calls as American fighters fell one by one to the superior Japanese pilots. "Don't let them through," Parks shouted over the radio before his own Buffalo exploded in a burst of orange flame. Within 20 minutes, 15 of the 26 Marine fighters had been shot down, their pilots either dead or floating in life rafts amid the Pacific swells. Meanwhile, Tominaga's bombers pressed home their attack on Midway's installations. The first bombs fell at 6:30 a.m., cratering runways and setting fuel dumps ablaze. Marine anti-aircraft gunners fought back with desperate courage, their batteries pumping streams of flak into the morning sky. Several Japanese aircraft fell to the ground fire, but most of Tominaga's force completed their bomb runs and turned northwest toward their carriers. The damage to Midway was significant, but not crippling. Powerhouses burned, sending thick black smoke into the sky, and the airfield's runways bore deep craters from Japanese bombs. Yet the atoll remained operational. More importantly, most of Midway's aircraft had survived by taking off before the attack arrived. Colonel Shannon's remaining bombers beat Winner 6 Marauders, SBD Dauntless dive bombers, and TBF Avenger torpedo planes had already departed on their own missions against the Japanese fleet. There is need for a second attack wave. This communication, intercepted by American listening posts, confirmed that Midway's defenses remained intact and that Nagumo would need to launch another strike. Admiral Nagumo faced a critical decision aboard his flagship Akagi. His second wave of aircraft sat on the carrier flight decks, armed with armor-piercing bombs and torpedoes for attacking enemy warships. Tominaga's message suggested he should rearm these planes with high-explosive bombs for another land attack. The decision would consume precious time that Admiral Spruance's task force was already using to close the distance for their own strike. Unknown to Nagumo, American dive bombers from Midway were already approaching his fleet from the south, while torpedo planes from Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown raced toward the Japanese carriers from the northeast. The converging forces would soon transform the peaceful morning into the most decisive naval engagement of the Pacific War. At 7:10 a.m., Major Lofton Henderson led 16 Marine SBD Dauntless dive bombers from Midway toward the Japanese carrier force. Behind him flew 11 obsolete Vought Vindicator scout bombers, their pilots grimly aware that their aircraft were nicknamed wind indicators. Due to their poor performance, these Marines faced the same hopeless odds that had claimed their fighter squadron brothers, but they pressed forward with unflinching determination. Henderson's formation approached the Japanese fleet at 8 a.m., flying into a wall of anti-aircraft fire that filled the sky with deadly black puffs. The Japanese carriers steamed in perfect formation, their escort vessels creating overlapping fields of fire that no aircraft could penetrate unscathed. Zero fighters rose from combat air patrol to intercept the Americans, their pilots eager to add more victories to their already impressive tallies. Major Henderson never hesitated, leading his squadron in a shallow glide, rather than a steep dive many of his pilots lacked experience. In proper dive bombing techniques, he aimed his aircraft at the carrier Hiryu. Japanese flak tore through his Dauntless, and Zero bullets shredded his wings. But Henderson maintained his attack course until the very end. His aircraft crashed in flames near Hiryu without scoring a hit, but his sacrifice inspired every Marine who followed. The Vindicators attacked next, their pilots pushing their obsolete aircraft beyond safe limits. Captain Richard Fleming dove his scout bomber toward the heavy cruiser Mikuma. Japanese shells bursting around his plane like deadly flowers. Fleming's aircraft absorbed tremendous punishment, but continued its attack until it crashed into Mikuma's after turret, causing significant damage and casualties among the Japanese crew. While the Marines from Midway pressed their desperate attacks, Admiral Nagumo wrestled with the most important decision of his naval career. Tomonaga's request for a second strike on Midway conflicted with standing orders to keep half his aircraft armed for attacks against enemy warships. At 7:15 a.m., Nagumo made his fateful choice, rearm the second wave with high-explosive bombs for another land attack. This decision triggered frantic activity throughout the Japanese carrier force. Mechanics and ordnance crews swarmed across the flight decks of Akagi, Kaga, Hiryu, and Soryu, removing armor-piercing bombs and torpedoes from aircraft and replacing them with high-explosive bombs. The process required careful handling of volatile ammunition in confined spaces, creating temporary chaos aboard each carrier. At 7:28 a.m., a reconnaissance float plane from the cruiser Tone transmitted a message that sent shock waves through the Japanese fleet. Sight what appears to be 10 enemy surface ships, in position bearing 10 degrees, distanced 140 miles from Midway. Admiral Nagumo's blood ran cold. American warships lurked somewhere beyond the horizon, exactly where Japanese intelligence had insisted no enemy forces existed. The discovery of American surface vessels transformed Nagumo's tactical situation completely. At 7:45 a.m., the same scout plane transmitted an even more alarming message: enemy force accompanied by what appears to be aircraft carrier bringing up the rear. Nagumo now faced the nightmare scenario every carrier commander dreaded: enemy flat tops within striking distance, while his own flight decks were cluttered with aircraft being rearmed. Panic gripped the Japanese carrier force as Nagumo reversed his previous order. The second wave aircraft, half-armed with land attack bombs, required rearming again with anti-ship weapons. Ordnance crews worked frantically to remove the high-explosive bombs they had just installed and replace them with armor-piercing bombs and torpedoes. The flight decks became obstacle courses of aircraft, ammunition, and fuel hoses. At 8:20 a.m., as Marine aircraft from Midway continued their attacks, Nagumo received the first reports of American torpedo planes approaching from the northeast. Radar operators aboard Japanese vessels detected multiple formations of enemy aircraft converging on their position from different directions. The admiral realized with growing alarm that he faced coordinated attacks from both Midway-based aircraft and carrier-based squadrons. The Japanese carriers turned into the wind to launch fighters and complete their rearming operations, but time was running out. American torpedo squadrons from Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown were already beginning their attack runs, flying low over the Pacific swells in obsolete aircraft that offered their crews little protection against Japanese defenses. The morning's deadly choreography was accelerating toward its climax. At 9:20 a.m., Lieutenant Commander John Waldron led Torpedo Squadron 8 from USS Hornet into what would become known as the most heroic and tragic attack in naval aviation history. 15 obsolete Douglas TBD Devastator torpedo bombers, flying barely 50 feet above the Pacific swells, approached the Japanese carrier force without fighter escort. Waldron had predicted this moment during pre-flight briefing. "If there's only one plane left to make a final run, I want that man to go in and get a hit." The Devastators were flying coffins, slow, lightly armored, and carrying torpedoes that often malfunctioned. These aircraft represented America's desperate attempt to strike back with inadequate weapons. Their maximum speed of 200 miles per hour made them easy targets for Japanese fighters, while their low-altitude approach eliminated any chance of escape. Waldron's pilots knew they were flying into almost certain death. Zero fighters from the Japanese Combat Air Patrol spotted Torpedo Squadron 8 first. Commander Shigeru Ataya led his pilots down from altitude, their machine guns chattering as they tore into the American formation. The first Devastator exploded in a ball of orange flame, its pilot and gunner disappearing instantly beneath the Pacific waves. Then another fell, and another, as Japanese fighters methodically destroyed Waldron's squadron. Ensign George Gay, flying the last Devastator in formation, watched his squadron leader's aircraft burst into flames ahead of him. Waldron's plane cartwheeled into the sea, taking with it one of the Navy's most experienced torpedo squadron commanders. Gay pressed his attack alone, Japanese bullets shattering his cockpit canopy and wounding him in the leg. His torpedo dropped toward the carrier Soryu, but passed harmlessly beneath her hull. Another failure of America's defective Mark 13 torpedoes. Gay's Devastator crashed into the Pacific moments later, He survived the impact and floated among the debris of his aircraft, hiding beneath a seat cushion whenever Japanese fighters strafed the area. From his unique vantage point in the water, Gate would become the only American witness to witness the climactic events that followed. Torpedo Squadron 6 from Enterprise met the same fate 20 minutes later. Lieutenant Commander Eugene Lindsay led 14 Devastators toward the Japanese carriers, but his formation had become scattered during the long flight from this ship. Japanese fighters fell upon the isolated American aircraft like wolves, shooting down 10 Devastators within minutes. Lindsay himself died when his aircraft exploded under concentrated zero fire, his final radio transmission simply stating, "Attack immediately." The most devastating loss came from Torpedo Squadron 3 off USS Yorktown. Lieutenant Commander Lance Massey led 12 Devastators toward Admiral Nagumo's carriers at 10 a.m., supported by 6 Wildcat fighters that proved woefully inadequate against superior Japanese Zeros. The aerial slaughter that followed horrified even veteran Japanese pilots. Within 15 minutes, 10 of 12 American torpedo planes had been shot down, their crews joining their comrades in the Pacific depths. As recorded in Walter Lord's definitive account, Incredible Victory, the sacrifice of these torpedo squadrons seemed futile in the immediate aftermath. Not a single torpedo found its target among the Japanese carriers. 41 brave airmen died in obsolete aircraft carrying effective weapons, their attacks apparently achieving nothing against the superior Japanese fleet. Critics would later question the wisdom of sending slow torpedo bombers without adequate fighter escort against the world's most experienced carrier pilots. Yet the torpedo squadron's sacrifice served a crucial purpose. That became apparent only in retrospect. Their low-level attacks had drawn every Japanese Zero fighter down to sea level, leaving the high-altitude approaches to the enemy carriers completely undefended. Japanese combat air patrol pilots, focused on destroying the American torpedo planes, failed to maintain altitude coverage above their precious flat tops. Admiral Nagumo's carriers remained vulnerable as they maneuvered to avoid the torpedo attacks. Their flight decks were still cluttered with aircraft being rearmed and refueled, creating perfect targets for high-altitude dive bombers. The Japanese admiral had no way of knowing that, even as his fighters finished massacring the American torpedo squadrons. 37 SBD Dauntless dive bombers from Enterprise were approaching his fleet from 20,000 feet altitude. The sacrificial attacks were about to bear unexpected fruit. At 10:22 a.m. on June 4, 1942, Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey spotted the wakes of Japanese destroyers cutting white furrows through the deep blue Pacific, flying at 19,000 feet above a seemingly empty ocean. McCluskey had led 37 SBD Dauntless dive bombers from USS Enterprise on what appeared to be a fruitless search. His fuel gauges showed dangerously low levels, and several pilots had already radioed requests to return to their carrier. McCluskey made a command decision that would alter the course of World War II. Instead of turning back, he followed the destroyer wakes northeast, gambling that they would lead him to the main Japanese fleet. His instincts proved correct. At 10:04 a.m., the enemy carriers appeared on the horizon like toys on a blue carpet. Takagi, Kaga, and Soryu steaming in perfect formation, their flight decks crowded with aircraft being refueled and rearmed. The Japanese carriers presented impossible targets. Zero fighters that had spent the morning destroying American torpedo squadrons were now landing to refuel and rearm, leaving the high-altitude approaches completely undefended. Anti-aircraft gunners aboard the enemy ships, focused on low-flying torpedo planes, never looked up to spot McCluskey's dive bombers positioned perfectly against the morning sun. "Attack, attack!" McCluskey radioed to his pilots, then pushed his Dauntless into a 70-degree dive toward the carrier Kaga. Behind him, 17 more dive bombers from his squadron followed in textbook formation, their airspeed building rapidly as they plummeted toward their targets. Simultaneously, Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie led 17 Dauntless bombers from USS Yorktown against the carrier Soryu, creating a coordinated attack that Japanese defenders could not possibly counter. The next 5 minutes would become the most decisive period in Pacific naval warfare. At exactly 10:26 a.m., Lieutenant Dick Best released his 1,000-pound bomb from 1,500 feet altitude, watching it arc perfectly toward the carrier Akagi's flight deck. The weapon penetrated near the ship's amidships elevator, detonating among dozens of fueled and armed aircraft. The explosion triggered secondary blasts that turned Akagi into a floating inferno within seconds. Aboard Kaga, Japanese sailors watched in horror as American dive bombers screamed down from the sky like avenging angels. The ship's captain, mortally wounded by bomb fragments, ordered his crew to abandon ship as fire spread beyond control throughout the vessel. The ship's experienced air crews, veterans of Pearl Harbor and the Dutch East Indies campaigns, perished in the flames along with their precious aircraft. Within minutes, Admiral Nagumo had lost 3 of his fleet carriers to an enemy force he had believed inferior in every respect. The only surviving Japanese carrier, Hiryu, launched an immediate counterattack under Captain Tomio Kaku. 18 Val dive bombers and 6 Zero fighters raced toward the American task force, determined to exact revenge for their sister ships. At 2:20 p.m., these aircraft found USS Yorktown and scored 3 direct hits that set the American carrier ablaze and knocked her out of action. Admiral Frank Fletcher, wounded in the attack on Yorktown, transferred operational command to Admiral Raymond Spruance aboard Enterprise. The battle was far from over, but the strategic balance had shifted decisively in America's favor. Japan's premier carrier pilots were dead, along with their irreplaceable aircraft and the mechanics who serviced them. The combined fleet's aura of invincibility had been shattered in 5 minutes of perfectly executed dive bombing. As afternoon shadows lengthened across the Pacific, both fleets prepared for the final phase of the battle. Hiryu remained operational and dangerous. While American forces retained the undamaged carriers, the outcome would depend on which side could deliver the next decisive blow in what had already become the most important naval engagement since the Age of Sail. Victory at Midway hung in the balance. Admiral Raymond Spruance paced the flag bridge of USS Enterprise. As afternoon shadows lengthened across Task Force 16, the Japanese carrier Hiryu remained at large somewhere beyond the horizon, her aircraft having already crippled USS Yorktown in a devastating counterattack. Spruance knew that as long as one enemy flattop survived, the Battle of Midway remained far from decided. Japanese naval aviation, even reduced to a single carrier, possessed enough striking power to turn victory into defeat. At 4:30 p.m., a scout plane from USS Yorktown transmitted the message Spruance had been waiting for: 1 carrier to battleships, 3 cruisers for destroyers, bearing northwest, distance 112 miles. Hiryu had been found, still steaming northwest with her escort vessels in what appeared to be a fighting withdrawal. The final act of the Pacific's most crucial battle was about to begin. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, hero of the morning's devastating attack on the Japanese carriers, was exhausted and low on fuel. His place would be taken by Lieutenant Earl Gallagher, leading Scouting Squadron 6 from Enterprise, and Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie from Yorktown's Air Group, now operating from Enterprise after his carrier had been damaged. Together, they would command 24 SBD Dauntless dive bombers in what might be the war's most important single airstrike. The American formation approached Hiryu at 5 p.m., flying through scattered clouds that provided perfect cover for their approach. Captain Tomio Kaku's carrier steamed in company with 2 battleships, 3 cruisers, and for destroyers a formidable surface force that bristled with anti-aircraft weapons. Yet Hiryu suffered from the same fatal weakness that had doomed her sister ships. Most of her fighters were absent, having been shot down during the morning's engagements or destroyed aboard the burning carriers. Lieutenant Gallagher led his dive bombers down through broken cloud cover, achieving complete tactical surprise over the Japanese task force. Anti-aircraft fire erupted from every enemy vessel as American aircraft ducked toward their target, but the volume of flak seemed lighter than the morning's encounters. Japan's elite carrier pilots and experienced gunners lay dead aboard Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, their replacements lacking both training and battle experience. Hiryu had learned from her sister ship's destruction. Her flight deck carried fewer aircraft than normal, reducing the risk of catastrophic secondary explosions. Damage control teams stood ready with firefighting equipment, while the ship's crew prepared for the attack they knew must come. Captain Kaku had survived the morning's disasters through superior seamanship and luck. He intended to make the Americans pay dearly for his carrier's destruction. The first American bombs missed their target, throwing up towering waterspouts around Hiryu's hull. Then Lieutenant Gallagher's aircraft achieved perfect positioning for his attack dive, releasing his 1,000-pound bomb from optimal altitude and angle. Secondary explosions rippled through Hiryu's interior as fuel and ammunition detonated in chain reactions. Unlike her sister ships, the carrier did not immediately burst into flames. Her reduced aircraft complement limited the initial conflagration. However, the structural damage proved fatal. Hiryu's forward elevator had been blown completely out of her hull, leaving a gaping hole that allowed seawater to flood her forward compartments. 3 more direct hits sealed Hiryu's fate. American bombs penetrated her flight deck, exploded in her engine rooms and started uncontrollable fires throughout the ship. Captain Kaku ordered maximum speed in a desperate attempt to outrun the flames, but Hiryu's damage was too extensive. By 6 p.m., the carrier had slowed to a crawl, her hull settling deeper into the Pacific swells as flooding spread through her lower decks. Admiral Nagumo, who had transferred his flag to the cruiser Nagara after Akagi's destruction, watched helplessly as his final carrier died beneath American bombs. The combined fleets for premier carriers veterans of Pearl Harbor, Wake Island, and the Dutch East Indies now lay destroyed or dying in the waters around Midway. Japan's naval aviation superiority in the Pacific had been eliminated in a single day's fighting. As evening approached, both fleets began withdrawing from the battle area. The decisive phase of the Battle of Midway was complete. As the crimson sun rose on June 5, 1942, the Pacific Ocean around Midway Atoll resembled a vast graveyard. Oil slicks marked the final resting places for Japanese aircraft carriers, their twisted hulks settling into the deep Pacific trenches. Debris fields stretched for miles, life rafts, aircraft parts, and personal belongings of the thousands of sailors and airmen who had perished during the previous day's titanic struggle. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, aboard his flagship Yamato, 300 miles northwest of the battle area, received the devastating reports with stoic resignation. His carefully planned operation to destroy the American Pacific Fleet had instead resulted in the worst defeat in Japanese naval history. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and here you were gone, taking with them over 200 aircraft and Japan's most experienced carrier pilots. The cream of the Imperial Navy's aviation forces had been wiped out in a single day. The strategic implications were staggering. Japan had lost not just for replaceable fleet carriers, but the trained aircrews who represented decades of peacetime preparation and combat experience. These pilots had honed their skills over China's battlefields and perfected their techniques during the lightning campaigns across the Pacific. Their replacement would require years that Japan, fighting a global war on multiple fronts, simply did not possess. Captain Tomio Kaku stood on Hiryu's blazing flight deck as his carrier's death throes continued through the night. Refusing evacuation, he had chosen to die with his ship in accordance with ancient samurai tradition. At 5 a.m. on June 5th, Hiryu finally slipped beneath the waves, her captain and several hundred crew members choosing honor over survival. The last of Admiral Nagumo's carriers had joined her sisters in the Pacific depths. USS Yorktown, severely damaged but still afloat, presented Admiral Spruance with a difficult decision. Salvage operations had begun under the escort of several destroyers, but Japanese submarines prowled the area like sharks drawn to blood. At dawn on June 6th, the submarine I-168, commanded by Commander Yahachi Tanabe, penetrated the American screen and fired a spread of torpedoes at the wounded carrier. The torpedoes struck Yorktown's port side, while a third hit the destroyer USS Hammond, which had been providing power to the carrier's salvage operations. Hammond broke in half and sank within minutes, her depth charges exploding as she went down and causing additional damage to Yorktown's hull. The carrier, veteran of the Coral Sea and Midway battles, finally rolled over and sank at dawn on June 7th, taking with her the hopes of completing what would have been a remarkable salvage operation. The loss of Yorktown represented America's heaviest casualty of the Midway battle, but it could not diminish the strategic victory that had been achieved. Admiral Nimitz's Pacific Fleet had faced odds of nearly 3-1 and emerged triumphant through superior intelligence, tactical innovation, and the extraordinary courage of pilots flying obsolete aircraft against overwhelming enemy forces. The human cost had been severe on both sides. Japan lost approximately 3,000 sailors and airmen, including many of her most experienced naval aviators. American casualties totaled 307 killed, most of them from the gallant torpedo squadrons that had sacrificed themselves to create opportunities for the decisive dive bomber attacks. Every American death represented a family destroyed, dreams unfulfilled, and potential unrealized. Yet the strategic transformation wrought by Midway extended far beyond casualty figures. Japan's offensive capability in the Pacific had been broken, forcing the empire into a defensive posture from which it would never recover. The myth of Japanese invincibility, carefully cultivated through 6 months of uninterrupted victories, lay shattered in the debris fields around Midway Atoll. Admiral Spruance summarized the battle's significance in his after-action report. The enemy's heavy losses in carriers and aircraft have removed the immediate threat to Hawaii and the West Coast. This understated assessment masked the deeper truth: America had seized the strategic initiative in the Pacific War and would never relinquish it. As Task Force 16 steamed eastward toward Pearl Harbor, its surviving aircrews looked back toward Midway with a mixture of exhaustion and pride. They had fought the most important naval battle of the modern era and emerged victorious against seemingly impossible odds. The tide of war in the Pacific had turned forever.